I've never told anyone this story. Not because I don't think they'll believe me, though, let's be honest, they won't, but because I still don't fully understand what happened that night. Even now, years later, I find myself awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, reliving every detail in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. But no matter how many times I go over it, the truth remains elusive, like a dream you can't quite remember after you wake up. But it was real. I swear to God, it was real. It all started on a cold December night. I was driving home from a business trip, one of those exhausting, mind-numbing drives through rural Pennsylvania, where the road stretches out in front of you like an endless ribbon of asphalt, and the only other cars you see are the occasional long-haul trucker. The trip itself had been uneventful, just a few meetings in Pittsburgh, but the drive back home was turning into a bit of a nightmare. The weather had taken a turn for the worse. It was snowing, nothing too heavy at first, just a light dusting that coated the road. But as the night wore on, the snow started coming down harder, and before long, I was driving through a full-blown snowstorm. Visibility was terrible, and I was forced to slow down to a crawl. I remember glancing at the clock on my dashboard. It was just after 10 p.m., and I still had a good 3 hours of driving ahead of me. The thought of pulling over and finding a motel crossed my mind, but I was determined to make it home that night. I just wanted to sleep in my own bed, to wake up in the morning without the looming threat of another long stretch of highway in front of me. The road was eerily quiet. No other cars, no signs of life. Just me, the snow, and the sound of my tires crunching through the icy slush. I was somewhere on Route 322, a desolate highway that cuts through the mountains, when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, maybe, cast by the snow swirling around my headlights. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was a woman standing by the side of the road, her silhouette barely visible against the backdrop of snow. I slowed down, my heart racing. What the hell was she doing out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a snowstorm? She wasn't wearing a coat, just a light dress that fluttered in the wind, and her hair, long, dark, and wet, clung to her face. I rolled down my window, and the cold air hit me like a slap in the face. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice sounding small and hollow in the howling wind. She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Something about her expression, blank, emotionless, made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just leave her out there. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, louder this time, hoping she'd snap out of whatever trance she seemed to be in. Finally, she moved. She nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, and without a word, she walked around to the passenger side of the car and got in. The temperature inside the car dropped noticeably as soon as she closed the door. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like she brought the cold in with her. I cranked up the heat, hoping it would help, but it didn't. She didn't say a word. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I glanced over at her, trying to make conversation. "Pretty bad storm, huh?" I said, forcing a smile. She didn't respond. I cleared my throat, feeling the tension in the car grow thicker by the second. "So, where are you headed?" Again, nothing. I started to get nervous. This was weird, really weird, but I tried to keep my cool. Maybe she was in shock, or maybe she was in shock, or maybe she didn't speak English. Either way, I figured the least I could do was get her to a gas station or a motel, somewhere warm where she could get help. But as we continued down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The air in the car felt heavy, oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 unsaid words was pressing down on me. And the woman, she didn't move, didn't blink. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She wasn't breathing. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that the poor visibility and my exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't deny what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. Her chest wasn't moving. No rise, no fall, just... I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind raced with questions. Who was she? What was she? I wanted to pull over, to stop the car and get her the hell out of there. But every time I glanced over at her, something stopped me. I couldn't explain it. But it was like there was an invisible force keeping me from doing anything. All I could do was drive, my hands shaking, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The snow outside was coming down harder now, the road barely visible through the thick curtain of white. The trees on either side of the highway loomed like dark, twisted figures, their branches clawing at the sky. I glanced at the woman again. Her head had turned ever so slightly, and now she was looking at me. Her eyes, God, her eyes. They were dark, too dark, like two endless voids. And in that moment, I realized something else, something even more horrifying. She wasn't wet. Her hair and dress, which I had thought were soaked from the snow, were completely dry. She was dry, like she had never even been outside, like she hadn't been standing in the middle of a snowstorm just minutes earlier. I tried to speak, to ask her what the hell was going on, but the words died in my throat. I couldn't form a single coherent thought. I was paralyzed with fear. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "What do you mean?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the sound of the wind outside. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to face me fully, her dark eyes boring into mine. They always stop, but they never make it home. I stared at her, my mind racing. What the hell was she talking about? Who were they? Was she talking about me? "What? What are you?" I stammered, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly I thought it might break. She smiled then, a slow, eerie smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You'll see," she whispered. And then, without warning, she was gone. I blinked, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. 1 second, she was there, and the next, she wasn't. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the highway. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I frantically looked around, hoping, praying, that I had imagined the whole thing. But the passenger seat was empty. The door was closed. There were no footprints in the snow outside, no sign that anyone had ever been there. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know what to do, where to go. Eventually, I forced myself to start the car again. I needed to get out of there. I needed to get home. But as I drove down the empty, snow-covered highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I made it home that night, but I wasn't the same. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not my family, not my friends. I didn't think they'd believe me, and honestly, I didn't want to talk about it. It was, too, disturbing. But the thing is, even after all these years, I still feel her presence. Late at night, when the wind howls outside and the snow falls thick and heavy, I swear I can hear her voice. Just a whisper, soft and faint, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have stopped." I've done my best to move on, to forget about that night, but sometimes, when I'm driving alone on a quiet road, I see her, standing by the side of the highway, just like she was that night, her dark eyes following me as I pass by. And I keep driving. I don't stop. Not anymore. Because I know now that if I do, I won't make it home. I've looked into it since then, trying to find any information that could explain what happened. I've read about local legends, Stories of ghostly hitchhikers, restless spirits haunting rural highways. But none of it quite fits. Maybe she was a ghost. Maybe she was something else entirely. Something I can't even begin to understand. All I know is that she's still out there waiting. So, if you ever find yourself driving through rural Pennsylvania on a cold, snowy night and you see a woman standing by the side of the road, don't stop. Keep driving. No matter how much you want to help, no matter how much you want to help, no matter how much she looks like she needs it. Just keep driving. Because if you stop, you may never make it home. And that's it. That's my story. I don't expect you to believe me, but I had to get it off my chest. Maybe it'll serve as a warning, or maybe it'll serve as a warning, or maybe it'll just be another ghost story, something you read and forget about. But I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the look in her eyes, or the way she whispered those final words. You shouldn't have stopped.